Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Steve Levitsky. I'm the director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard. Welcome back to the Dr. Class Tuesday webinar. I want to start, as always, by introducing you to my amazing co-chair, Francis Agopian.
Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you with us.
And also thank our crack Dr. Class team of Paula Ibarra, Jillian Scales, and Gabrielle Patterson, the folks who make this and so many other events possible. Also, today's panel is being co-sponsored by the Dr. Class Mexico program. Many thanks to them for helping to put this panel together. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we launch in. First of all, Spanish language translation is available for this event. So if you want to hear the event in Spanish, just go to the interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Secondly, we will record today's webinar, and it will hopefully be available on Dr. Class's YouTube channel. I didn't even know we had a YouTube channel before this year. It will be uploaded on the YouTube channel after today's session. Third, we encourage questions, and if you have questions for our panelists, we ask that you send it through the Q&A tab. You'll see that the chat function is disabled, but you can nevertheless send your questions through the Q&A tab at any point during the panel, and we will try to get to them in the Q&A part of the panel. So, as all of you know, Mexico had a major midterm election this past summer. There was an awful lot at stake, or there certainly was perceived to be a lot at stake, both for the AMLO government and for the opposition. And now that the dust has settled a bit, we wanted to have a conversation and discussion about the consequences, the political consequences of the midterm election. What, if anything, does the election tell us about the strength and weakness of the Morena government? What does it tell us about the state of the political opposition? And most importantly, what does it say about the state and perhaps the future of Mexican democracy? We are really fortunate to have with us today 4 outstanding scholars of Mexican politics. Let me just introduce each of them up front, and then I'll ask them to speak each for 10 minutes. And if they follow my guidelines, that will leave us about 30 minutes for Q&A. And during the Q&A, Fran and I will take your questions and feed them to the panelists. And the idea is to close around 1:20 or 1:25. So it is an honor to introduce our 4 panelists today. I'm going to go in alphabetical order, and I think the presentations will go in alphabetical order. Lorena Besera is the head of public opinion research for one of Mexico's leading newspapers, Reforma. She's a PhD in political science from Duke University and has 2 decades of experience in the area of public opinion, including working in the office of the presidency under Felipe Calderón. Dr. Besera has collaborated as an editorialist in Reforma, in Voz y Voto, in Eje Central, and in Animal Político. And she's contributed to the latest volume on the precision of electoral surveys sponsored by Mexico's National Elections Institute, the INE. Welcome, Dr. Besera. Our second speaker will be Denise Gesser, who many of you know. She's a prominent analyst of Mexican politics, both within Mexico and internationally. She writes a political column for the Mexican newspaper Reforma and also for the news weekly Proceso. She's hosted a couple of political talk shows on Mexican television and is a frequent commentator on Mexican politics in not only Mexico, but in the rest of North America as well. Dr. Gesser holds a PhD in politics from Princeton University, and she's author of numerous publications on Mexican politics, including important work on the politics of the Pro Sol program in the 1990s, on transnational actors and democracy promotion in Mexico, on the problems of Mexico's new and emerging democracy over the last couple of decades. She's also worked as a consultant to the UNDP and the Open Society Institute. She served on the Citizens Committee in charge of investigating Mexico's dirty war, and she sat on the board of the Human Rights Commission for Mexico City for 8 years. Welcome, Dr. Gesser. Our third speaker is Gustavo Flores Macias, who is now Associate Vice President for International Affairs, as well as Associate Professor of Government at Cornell University. Gustavo's research covers a range of issues related to political and economic development in Latin America, including the politics of economic reform, taxation and state capacity, and the militarization of law enforcement. Gustavo's first book, After Neoliberalism, was published a little less than a decade ago by Oxford University Press. He's also editor of an excellent volume, The Political Economy of Taxation in Latin America, which looks at the political obstacles to progressive taxation in the region. That book came out, I think, in 2019, a couple of years ago. Although Gustavo's work covers all of Latin America, he's a Latin Americanist, broadly defined. He's also a prominent analyst of Mexican politics. He's published several important pieces on the state of Mexican democracy in the Journal of Democracy and other venues. Finally, last but certainly not least, Amalia Pulido Gomez is assistant professor in the Political Studies Division at CIDE in Mexico City. Before joining CIDE, she was a postdoctoral fellow at El Colegio de Mexico in the project Big Data and Social Sciences. Dr. Pulido Gomez earned her PhD in political science from the University of North Texas, and her research includes the study of political and criminal violence, political parties and elections, and the use of big data in political science. Welcome to you, Dr. Pulido Gomez. All right, I'm going to shut up and pass the baton to our first speaker, who is Lorena Besera.
Hello. Well, thanks, Steve Levitsky and Francis Hagopian, as well as the Rockefeller Center for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I have a few slides I would like to share. Here we go. So I would like to begin with 3 points that I would like you to take away from this talk. First of all, there is definitely a new balance of powers in Mexico that became evident after the midterms. Secondly, this new mapping of electoral forces was shaped in great part by specific groups of the electorate, like the middle classes, that have made their opposition to López Obrador very clear. And finally, the 2024 election, the presidential election, will be a result of many, many variables, like the capacity of the left to remain united and the endurance of the opposition alliance, as well as its strategic decisions. So all in all, what we see after the 2021 election is that there is no saying who will win the next presidential in Mexico yet. Just very quickly, during the first half of López Obrador's term, we saw an atypical shape of forces in Mexico. Basically, it was characterized by a strong concentration of the power in the hands of the president. And this was possible because of the landslide victories that Morena had in this election. López Obrador, we can say he has been enjoying a corruption bonus, right? As a result of the sort of disastrous Peña presidency. And he has very smartly tried to assign all the negative visions of corruption to the PAN as well, because we have seen that there is ample evidence that the PAN has also engaged in corruption activities. One more important thing, and this has to do with the alliance, the PRI is still the most rejected party nationwide. Around 42% of the voters tell us that they would never vote for the PRI. So this hinders the possibility for the opposition, and they have to be very careful in what decisions they make in selecting their candidates and in the issues they choose for their agenda in campaigning. In the 2021 midterm elections, Morena did not register the electoral victories it expected at the beginning of the campaigns. It was positioned to be landslide victories in the state, municipal, and in the lower chamber. But this really did not happen. One of the issues is that AMLO's approval ratings are no longer historical outliers, as we saw at the beginning of his presidency. And this is unlikely to change. He's probably going to remain with the similar approval ratings. He has lost support from the more educated segments of the population, which were very important in his 2018 triumph. He has lost support from the north and the center regions of the country and a lot of the younger voters. He registers high disapproval ratings on the most important issues that are of concern to the voters, like the handling of security, economy, and even poverty alleviation, even though he's well approved on social programs. And even on the issues where he is strongest campaigning, like combating corruption, his numbers are not that good. So he really has to do very important strategic decisions to campaign in the 2024 election. Let me remind you that in Mexico, we don't have presidential re-election yet. So this is going to be regarding his party. But Morena did exhibit an important expansion at the state level with the help of the Green Party and basically the weakening of the PRI and also the PAN at the state level. And this also made it possible to hold on to the 50%+1 majority in the lower chamber, but it lost the congressional majority. And this is going to lead us to important political confrontations in the second half of López Obrador's term, because he has three key constitutional reforms in mind. He has an energy reform, an electoral reform, and a reform to change the National Guard, which was a civilian corps, to add it to the military corps. So this all has to do with constitutional reforms, and now the opposition has a veto power. The opposition did manage to form a bloc that will give it this constitutional veto. But on the other hand, and this is also very important for the 2024 election, because we're going to have concurrent elections, the presidential election, many state elections, almost half of the country, and many municipal elections. And the opposition had important victories in the more populated municipalities, while Morena had more victories in municipalities with middle and low levels of population. All in all, the opposition should have performed better in the past elections, but their strategies are still not that good. I think they're still lacking a good diagnosis of the electorate and how to reach the opposition electorate. This is a historical series of the approval ratings of the president since Cedillo. This is a Reforma series. And here we can see that López Obrador really did not get to his midterm in optimal terms. He was basically the same as the rest of the presidents. Sorry. Calderon was even better approved in his midterms, but he didn't have a good performance as López Obrador did. And this had to do a lot with the alliances that they formed, particularly with the Green Party, that just to be precise, the Green Party in Mexico really has nothing to do with any green things, you know? And these are the issues that concern the population. This is what they tell us that they want the parties and the presidents to focus on. We see that it's basically security, economy, corruption had an important role during the Peña presidency. Obviously now it's the health COVID pandemic. And in all of this, López Obrador does not have good numbers. As of the 2021 election, Morena now holds 16 out of 32 states, which is huge. And in terms of the population, what we see is that the increase in the population governed by states is huge for Morena, mostly at the expense of the PRI losses and 2 states that were lost by the PAN, right? But when we look at the municipal level, they both had losses, but the opposition coalition governs more population than it did before because of the municipalities that they won. And this has a lot to do with the role of the middle classes. We really did see the middle classes mobilizing against López Obrador. And in the composition of the lower chamber, because of the important alliances that they formed at the district level, they were able to hold on to the 50%+1 majority, but we see the opposition bloc, and they did not form the 330 plus congressmen to have the congressional majority. What can we expect in the second half of López Obrador's term? And we can discuss this obviously in the Q&A. We can expect similar approval ratings for the president, and this has a lot to do with the fact that in general, the population does not reject the president. What we have seen is that the opposition to the president has grown. It started off with around 15 to 18% at the beginning of 2019, and now it has grown to 35–40%. But this has mostly to do with the opposition to the president, not really the voters wanting to go back to the PAN and the PRI or the PRD. The PRD is basically just at its minimal level. We can also expect the president to deepen his blatant intervention in elections. This really is a concern because we have seen a lot of presidents in Mexico intervene in elections in a certain way, but the way that he has done this and so bluntly is of a concern. He uses his morning press conferences to intervene in elections. He has violated the law. And now in his electoral reform, he is trying to tamper with the electoral institution and with the electoral tribunal, right? So we can expect him to continue to try to do this. We can also expect the internal struggles with Morena to become more salient as the president's power weakens and the presidential election approaches. Obviously, we have seen a lot of internal struggles. This is very common in most parties. It is very common in the left because the left in Mexico really has not been traditionally unified. The main unifying factor was López Obrador. He was able to unify the left, but he is not going to be on the ballot in 2024. So we don't know what's really going to happen inside Morena. We see struggles every day. Right now with the renewal of the leadership, you know, they are fighting every day. We can also expect intense political confrontation with the opposition. The role of the middle classes in opposing the president and Morena is going to be very important and see who they are deciding. And if the PAN and the PRI do not maintain their alliance, the third place, whoever becomes in the third place, was obviously going to become extinct. We can also expect strategic voter from anti-López Obrador voters. Some of the questions that remain: will there be a key role for women? How heavy are these issues that López Obrador has not been able to solve are going to weigh in the next election? And the performance of Morena at the state and municipal level. We can also expect López Obrador to intensify his clientelistic operation, which really has nothing to do with poverty alleviation. His distribution of social programs is huge. It has increased over the past 3 years, but the results in poverty alleviation are really not good. We also expect more triumphs for Morena at the state level, particularly because of the governorships that are going to be in dispute in 2022. And in 2023, have an important election, which is Estado de Mexico. We have to see what happens there with the opposition, whether they can remain united or not. All in all, the opposition voters seem to be deciding between the lesser of two evils, particularly the voters that are anti-López Obrador. And I will finish here. I hope I was in time.
Not bad, thanks. Okay, our second speaker is Denise Gesser.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I will begin by providing a context in which the midterms took place, then explaining what I believe the shift in the balance of power has been that ties into what Lorena's slides presented. And finally, I will discuss what I think will be what comes next in the next 3 years. Over the past 3 years, López Obrador has moved steadily and with an explicit objective to centralize power in the executive branch, what Nancy Bermeo calls executive aggrandizement, specifically in his own hands, in order to enact permanent and irreversible changes under the rubric of the fourth transformation. And his actions have led to legitimate concerns, therein the growing opposition, electoral opposition that manifested itself in the midterms, legitimate concerns about the future of democracy in Mexico. He has often resorted to eroding democratic norms, attacking civil society institutions, threatening the survival of the National Electoral Institute, and politicizing the judiciary, as evidenced by the most recent case in which the Attorney General's office is attempting to jail 31 scientists in a maximum security prison for alleged corruption. López Obrador is also downsizing the apparatus of the state to fulfill his promise of austerity and frequently exercising meta-constitutional powers. He has dismantled regulatory institutions or staffed them with party loyalists, has seized discretionary control of the budget, and seems intent on endowing the Mexican military with an unprecedented amount of political and economic power. And his argument is that the return of a strong leader is necessary to effect the foundational change he has promised. He argues that he is cleaning house, combating corruption, cutting graft, ending privileges, and can only do so by being in full command of all government levers. The fight against the neoliberal model of the past and its legacy of privilege and elitism has become the justification to eliminate constraints on presidential rule and pursue as well the politics of identity and polarization. Today, public debates in Mexico aren't centered on how to address the country's problems deliberately, collectively, through a democratic logic. Identity, as defined by the president, has become a political tool to disqualify opponents as enemies of the people, conservatives who defend the status quo, elites who prey on the poor, and the opposition as morally bankrupt. And in the meantime, cowed and discredited opposition leaders have been unable to offer an alternative narrative or political strategy that appeals to a broader swath of the population that still supports López Obrador, although as Lorena's slides show, there is growing dissatisfaction, if you look at the polls at a more granular level, with his policies. And prior to the midterm elections, only Mexico's feminists had emerged as the true thorn in López Obrador's side, as a singular movement that he does not seem to understand, cannot control, and doesn't know how to suppress. This is a brief context of trends that I think awaken legitimate concerns about democratic erosion under the guise of improving democracy, while Mexico witnesses a state-led weakening of institutions that made democracy work, however, imperfectly. Now, what happened during the midterms? Strangely enough, for those of us who were quite pessimistic, the resilience of democratic guardrails. It was not, as Lorena has pointed out, a resurrection of the 2018 electoral tsunami that the president had hoped for, but it also wasn't a clear rejection of the government that the opposition wanted. Morena advanced territorially in terms of the number of governorships it won in an unholy alliance with the Green Party. But the opposition coalition managed to deny Morena the constitutional majority it wanted and needed in Congress. The left also suffered a stinging defeat by losing half of a key bastion, Mexico City. Now, in order to pass constitutional reforms that López Obrador has indicated are his priority for the remainder of his term, and there are 3 of them: an electoral reform to the National Electoral Institute to remove its current electoral counselors and return it possibly to Gobernación, a second reform to in the energy sector to assure the dominance of state-run electricity, and finally, a third reform, military reform, so that the allegedly civilian National Guard will actually be run by the Ministry of Defense. In order to enact those reforms, he will need opposition votes. How will he get them? Blackmail, pressure, bartering, peeling away votes, I think, from the PRI, the party most vulnerable to presidential pressure due to the number of skeletons in its closet as a result of corruption. And the only way to contain López Obrador from the perspective of the opposition is it remains united. And that is very far from a foregone conclusion. Now, aside from the specific electoral results, the most important outcome of the midterms, in my mind, is a shift in perceptions, a shift in the mindset, a shift regarding López Obrador and Morena's aura of invincibility. The results of the midterm election have elicited a series of very strong responses in other areas, from the National Electoral Institute, the INEGI, the Coneval, the institution that measures poverty, the Supreme Court, and even the Federal Electoral Tribunal, who have sent messages to the president since the election that the rules also apply to him. The INE organized elections that were perceived as impeccable. Coneval has collected hard data on how social programs are actually not alleviating poverty. The Supreme Court refused to support the extension of Arturo Saldívar, the president of the court's term, as AMLO wanted and as Saldívar wanted, which would have helped the president try to maintain political pressure over the Supreme Court. And also we saw an electoral tribunal that fought back against the president of the tribunal, who was a supporter of López Obrador, removing him from his position and sending signs of autonomy, of resilience, of trying to contain presidential pressure. In different ways, in different forms, institutions after the midterms are starting to contain discretionality. They're sending the message, as I said, that the rules apply to the president. The National Electoral Institute is saying to AMLO, if you want consultas populares, you have to accept the rules imposed by the Constitution. The Supreme Court is telling him that he didn't have internal support to unconstitutionally extend the term of Arturo Saldívar. INEGI and Coneval are telling him that his social programs are not working. And in the face of these signs of autonomy, the president's response has been predictable. He has called members of the Supreme Court conservative ministers who support the old regime. He has said that those who criticize him from other institutions that were created to endow the Mexican political system with checks and balances, he has said they don't want to combat corruption. He has threatened with submitting the counselors of the INE to a political trial. So imperfect, insufficient, but indispensable institutions created in the transition to Mexico's electoral democracy now appear to be standing up and confirming that they are beginning to understand that they were under siege and they're trying to return to their foundational task, which is assure impartial elections, assure a level playing field, provide data in the face of a president who constantly says he has other data. In other words, institutions that were created to dismantle the imperial presidency that López Obrador has tried to resurrect are acting, I think, in a way that they hadn't acted prior to the midterm election. Now, what next? For those worried about the fate of Mexico's democracy, I think that there are troubling signs ahead. First of all, an important part of AMLO's base of support, and also many members of the left-leaning intelligentsia in Mexico and abroad, have afforded the president a kind of intellectual amnesty, wherein much of what he does or says, regardless of its viability or consistency, is justified, even if those policy actions or those forms of behavior contradict democratic rules or are plainly conservative, not progressive or even leftist. Time and again, López Obrador has exhibited behavior that puts him at the threshold of authoritarian practices. He submits key policy issues to public referendum with his own rules, pushing the country towards a position of majoritarian extremism, in which democracy is not viewed as an inclusive or negotiated process, but as a constant confrontation against the popular will, el pueblo, and the elites that don't want change. And I think that throughout the remainder of his term, those points of conflict that Lorena pointed to will remain. López Obrador will continue to portray institutions as obstacles, will continue to say that he is returning power to the people, will continue to vilify through the mañanera those who criticize him, and he will encourage the personalization of power in himself as someone who, in his view, deserves to not be questioned because of his moral rectitude and incorruptibility. And I also predict that he will name his successor through the resurrection of the practice associated with authoritarian dominant party rule, which is the dedazo, even if that may be disguised as a sort of internal poll within Morena. And as for the opposition, the president has been correct in his diagnosis. Mexico has been a country governed by elites who extract rents, offer contracts to their cronies, privatize public goods, siphon off public resources for personal gain. Mexico's political and economic elites prior to López Obrador did not depoliticize the judicial system, did not limit rent seeking, did not promote transparency or accountability, and did not seek to make the economic system more inclusive or the political system more representative. And the result of not having done this is López Obrador. Extractive anti-democratic elites gave birth to a combative son that is now decrying them, both in terms of their economic behavior as entrepreneurs and their political behavior as parties. the PRI, the PAN, and the PRD. And that is a powerful narrative that is disseminated every day that the opposition has not been able to counter. Morena is en route to becoming a dominant party whose success and longevity reside in its capacity to maintain discipline among disparate political factions under its pragmatic umbrella. And it's unclear what's going to happen when López Obrador is no longer the candidate in 2024. Meanwhile, corruption remains systemic, impunity remains assured for many, including Peña Nieto and others involved, for example, in Odebrecht. Institutions can and are manipulated by the president. Cronyism is pervasive, and the impunity pact that has characterized Mexico has been signed by all parties at one time or another. And to close, I'd say most of the positive change that we did see in Mexico over the past 20 years has been the result of a concerted agenda to call the political class into account, to assure better representation, better democratic rule, and try to create an economic model capable of producing growth with equity. Those goals do not depend on one man or one movement, however noble their intentions. The country's perennial problems derive from the absence of strong institutions, robust institutions, that are capable of providing systemic checks and balances, transparency, and horizontal accountability. So the polarized politics of López Obrador exploit the results of this dysfunctional democracy: daily injustice, growing inequality and poverty, the legitimate resentment of those who've been left behind or ignored, or left, whose demands have been left unanswered by a political system that has historically served its elites and not its citizens. The fourth transformation, however, seems to be more of a narrative that evidences these problems, but has not shown how it can solve them. So some celebrate the return of a strong president with ample support, ample discretionary powers, and a dominant party at his service, ready to dismantle the old regime in the country of privileges, while others fear the long shadow of the caudillo, who is increasingly co-governing with an omnipresent military. So the question for Mexico over the next 3 years is whether the country's democratic guardrails that stood up after the midterm election will hold over the next 3 years, and how much of the institutional framework will be left to pick up the pieces after López Obrador leaves a transformation that could end up being tantamount to an institutional evisceration. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. Our third speaker is Gustavo Flores Macias. Gustavo, you there?
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. I am really grateful for the invitation, the opportunity to be here today. Many thanks to Fran, to Steve, the leadership of Dr. Klaas and its team. Just to be here with such a distinguished group is a real treat. Sharing the floor with Dr. Becerra, Dr. Gesser, Dr. Pulido Gomez. I really appreciate that. I very much appreciate these insights that were presented before me, whereas my colleagues have done a wonderful job at pointing to some of the immediate ways in which the 2021 midterm elections have made a difference. I would like to take a broader view and point to 3 important lines of continuity that the election cycle seemed unable to shape, at least in any meaningful way. And these 3 trends have to do with, first of all, the fragmentation and deinstitutionalization of the party system. The second has to do with a continuity in the commercial relations with the United States. And the third one with the militarization of public life. My emphasis on these 3 trends is not to say that the AMLO administration hasn't done things differently compared to previous presidents, or that the midterm elections were not consequential. I would argue that the AMLO administration has certainly done many things worse, others for the better, but rather my hope here is to point out that many of the challenges facing the country seem much beyond the personalities and parties in office and beyond the whims of a midterm election. So I'll start by focusing on the party system. Post-transition Mexico met the turn of the century with a relatively stable three-party system, the PRD on the left, the PRI in the center, the PAN on the right, with fairly defined programmatic characteristics, roots in society, complexity in territorial organization, and some stability in the vote share over time. Since what we have seen is a steady decline in the stability and institutionalization of the party system, and the midterm elections highlight the continuation of this trend, where the midterm elections corroborated that Mexico today has a party system with weaker roots in society, even weaker programmatic alternatives, less and less stability in the party vote across elections, and the increased electoral importance of dubious electoral vehicles. I mean, we can think of mercenaries really, such as the Verde, the Partido Verde, the Green Party, but sadly the PRD today. The emphasis on personalities rather than parties has become one of the main features of the system. And although the formation of alliances for or against AMLO's project may seem like there are meaningful programmatic electoral blocks, the reality is that there is very little programmatic glue holding the blocks together. Moreover, party identification is very low in today's Mexico, so voters do not really feel an allegiance for political parties. Mexico finds itself in a paradoxical situation of hyperpolarization with fairly low partisan attachments. And in this sense, given the government's many poor policy choices, it is remarkable that the opposition couldn't do better in the midterm elections, especially in the context of elections in which incumbents tend to lose ground, right? Midterm elections, we typically see incumbents losing ground, and in the context of a pandemic that has also tended to hurt incumbents worldwide. The election suggests not only the disenchantment among many voters that had originally voted for Morena, as my co-panelists have mentioned already, but also the inability of the opposition to generate any appealing policy alternatives. The PRD is a zombie party. The PAN is rolling out the red carpet for the Spanish far-right party Vox. The PRI is spending most of its time these days defending its prominent members from corruption allegations and calling these political witch hunts, which doesn't resonate much with broad sectors of the population. Now, the continuation of this party system trend has important implications, of course. It matters, at least there's plenty of research out there that suggests that the more fragmented and less institutionalized party systems, the more fragmented and deinstitutionalized these systems are less able to serve as checks on executive power, and they also lend themselves to more drastic policy changes. The second point of continuity has to do with a commercial relation with the United States. The catastrophic fears of this sudden decoupling from the US and abandoning of Mexico's trade commitments have not really materialized, at least not yet under AMLO's administration. Every Mexican president since the adoption of NAFTA has understood the importance of the commercial relation with the US, and I believe AMLO is not an exception. His administration's approach, in spite of the rhetoric, has been generally pragmatic toward the US. His administration renegotiated NAFTA in a way that would be hard to distinguish in many ways, and ironically, because of the criticism, but hard to distinguish from previous administrations, what they would have done in terms of negotiations or their approach to the relationship with the US. And even though we often read in the newspapers claims that the current administration is in violation of the letter of the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, the reality is that the agreement has actually provided cover for the AMLO administration to make changes to bring protections for workers that were, at least in my view, way, way overdue. AMLO's administration has also leveraged this relationship by free riding off the mega fiscal stimulus adopted in the United States. Right? This US stimulus has indirectly provided a lifeline for broad sectors of the Mexican population severely affected by the economic downturn. And the stimulus has boosted not only remittances, but also tourism into Mexico, has softened the blow to Mexico's manufacturing sector. I mean, these are all measures that by most accounts, the AMLO administration should have adopted itself, but this has allowed, at least the US stimulus has allowed the Mexican government to not have to deal with this directly. The third trend I'd like to point out has to do with the continuity in the militarization of public life. And when I say continuity of militarization, I don't mean to say the effort has been linear. Militarization has certainly accelerated and has permeated an ever-growing number of public spheres with this administration. The midterm elections did not make a difference in this regard, I don't think. The government coalition loss of seats in Congress did not affect this trend. The failure of civilian institutions has been such, and the public's discontent with those institutions has been such, that the last 4 administrations from 3 different political parties have resorted to the military to try to address problems that civilians are seemingly unable to address. But while previous administrations relied on the armed forces outside of the legal framework, this administration has legalized the militarization of public life. Not only has it issued presidential decrees establishing the participation of the armed forces in public safety until 2024, but it also passed a law that formally created the National Guard with military features, military personnel, and under the de facto supervision of the Ministry of Defense. And further, there is a worrisome contrast between the across-the-board austerity measures adopted by the AMLO administration and the special status of the armed forces, who have remained untouched by austerity. In research by Yanilda Gonzalez or Eduardo Moncada, Jessica Sarping, and others, there is evidence of a zero-sum relationship between the strengthening of the military with respect to the civilian police. In Mexico, the administration's creation of a militarized National Guard made it clear that in the fight against organized crime, Plan A is to rely on the military, and so is Plan B. Beyond public safety, in addition to the task of immigration control, which previous administrations had also assigned to the military, the armed forces have been put in charge of overseeing the country's ports, customs administrations along Mexico's borders. The armed forces are also participating in infrastructure projects, from building government bank branches to building and running the Mexico City airport, railroad project for tourism in the Yucatan Peninsula known as Tren Maya. So there has been, in a way, an explosion of this militarization, a militarization that had started much earlier. And to me, this responds to important constraints that the weakness of the Mexican state and the weakness of the Mexican bureaucracy have brought about to different administrations, regardless of the party. Now, these 3 trends, the fragmentation and the institutionalization of the party system, the continuity in commercial relations with the US, the militarization of public life, which remain unaffected by the midterm elections, respond more to structural forces rather than particularities of AMLO's government. In my view, they are rooted in broader dynamics that generate incentives for politicians in office, regardless of the party. I certainly don't see much in the way of addressing these broader dynamics in this administration, the way we didn't see them in previous administrations. But we would certainly see differences of degree depending on the administration, right? Depending on the party. But the nature and magnitude of organized crime and impunity, these beasts that we've been feeding for generations, the economic dependence on trade with the United States since 1994, and government's lackluster, at best, results across parties and administrations seem to escape the reach of the administration in turn, and certainly the reach of a midterm election cycle. Thank you all for your time.
Thanks, Gustavo. Okay, our 4th speaker is Amalia Pulido Gomez. Amalia?
Yes, thank you. I will share my screen, and thanks for the invitation. It's really nice to be here with colleagues that I truly admire. So thank you so much for this. Just let me. I think you can see my screen, right? Okay. So I will talk about 4 main issues heading 2024. I want to talk about the new balances of power, local politics, and the new configuration of politics in the local level. Morena as a party and the challenges that AMLO will face within his own party. And finally, I will talk about the cycle of political violence that we live in these midterm elections, and a problem that will continue in the Mexican political system in 2024. So this is just a configuration of the Congress. I won't spend a lot of time, since Lorena did a great job explaining how the Congress is its form. But what we can see is that, well, Morena without allies, it doesn't have simple majority. And I think that's a really important thing to talk about today, because all the project for the president depends on his alliances with the Green Party, the most opportunistic party in Mexico. And I think that alliance is quite fragile, and the Greens can change its mind anytime. So I think this is really interesting. The president depends on this party, on the Green Party. I mean, although they can they can join alliances with other parties. Right now, his political future depends on this, on the Green Party. So I think that's really something really interesting that we will see in the next months and in the next years, how the Greens will behave. We know that the Greens are more like an enterprise and not a political party. So anything can change in this legislative configuration of power. The other thing that Lorena and Denise already mentioned is that no party has supermajority. They need 333 seats or votes to change, to make any constitutional reform, and no one party has this. However, and we can expect that the president is approaching a lot of priistas actors in the political system. And I think that's really interesting, because we could expect a political future where even priistas can join AMLO's project. And I will talk about this more in the local politics configuration. But right now we can see, I mean, the PRI has these 71 seats, but a lot of these seats are controlled by the governors. So if AMLO, if AMLO can persuade like priistas to join his project, he can achieve this supermajority. I mean, we can expect this at some point. So we will see like this new game of power in the next months. I think we can expect disputes within parties, especially the PRI and of course Morena, that I will talk in the third section. But we will see these disputes within parties, and even in the priistas, we will see this in the next months. I mean, as Lorena already mentioned, Morena has 16 governorships. Now is a party with the biggest power in the states. And the next years, we will have a lot of alternation in power. In 2022, we'll have 6 states electing governors, and I think this map will change significant in the next year, right? We can expect Morena winning Oaxaca, also Quintana Roo, and other states, and this can change considerably the power configuration in Mexico. So heading 2024, I think AMLO knows that he's not enough for this continuity of his project, of his political project. What we saw in 2021, and we can say, well, Morena was the biggest winner, but I think there are some caveats, and we can be really cautious reading this winning with Morena. And I think Lorena already mentioned this, but Mexico City and the Mexico states are really interesting when we analyze the results. First, Mexico City, Morena didn't get the results that they were expecting, and I think that's really interesting. And also in Mexico State, traditional priista state, the PRI did really bad in 2018, and what we saw in 2021, it's a recovery, an electoral recovery. The PRI recovered a lot of municipios and the local Congress. Now they have, Alfredo del Mazo now has a lot of political support in these 2 last years in his government. So I think we should be really cautious reading these results. I think the big, this big winning of Morena in 2021 can be his big failure in 2024. People, a lot of citizens in a lot of states are still in this Morena tsunami, and we can see that in Mexico State and in Mexico City, a lot of citizens are not they are not happy with the results that Morena governments are producing. We saw a lot of the candidate selection process within Morena was really problematic because the president and I did a database based on the profiles of the candidates with Morena, and what we saw, it was actors really close to AMLO's trying to control and trying to centralize the candidate selection process at all levels. And I think that can be really problematic in terms of the internal democracy for Morena. And in 2024, we will see a lot of disputes within Morena. So I think AMLO knows that there are a lot of challenges heading 2024. And he has some strategies, and I think the most obvious strategy is to capture opposition governors. We are seeing AMLO's trying to have these good relationships with Quirino, for example. Now he will be the ambassador in Spain, a priista governor in Sinaloa, and I think we will see this same behavior with Fayad, Murat in Oaxaca, and especially Alfredo del Mazo. I think the state of Mexico is really crucial for AMLO's political project. And I think in the next years, especially in 2023, when Alfredo del Mazo has to leave the office, we could expect him to maybe join the AMLO's team, or maybe having a strategic position within AMLO's project to ensure a 2024 victory for Morena's race, right? So I think AMLO has this strategy. He has this really clear strategy to divide the opposition. And I think if we start seeing the opposition with divisions in 2024, it's easy to think or to imagine that whoever the next presidential candidate of Morena will be, I think they will have a really good likelihood to win the elections, especially if the president continues this strategy. However, I also think one of the biggest challenges for AMLO's political project is his own party, Morena. So what we are seeing in Morena, it's a really low institutionalized party. They have really low levels of internal discipline. We saw this in the 2021 election. A lot of the members and the important actors within Morena were really angry because the simulated democratic mechanisms to select candidates. And I think the candidate selection in 2024 for the presidential election will cause deep divisions within strategical actors within Morena. So I think the president knows this, and that's the reason he's trying to implement other kind of strategies as dividing the opposition and to attract these former or these silent governors in good positions also in his team, and trying to cerrar filas with his own presidential candidate. We know that he already has some preferences for who will be the next presidential candidate. It can be Claudia, it can be Marcelo, but I think in these 3 years, a lot of things can happen internally with Morena. So I think one of the biggest challenges for the president is this, his own party, and he knows that, and we will see in the following years a lot of disputes and internal divisions within Morena, also at the local level. And I really want to talk about the political violence that we saw in 2021. I think it's the elephant in the room, and it has been the elephant in the room for several years. And I think this is, and this will be one of the biggest issues in the 2024 election. I think it's really urgent, and is really worried to talk about what is happening in Mexico in terms of the infiltration and the party capture that organized crime has, especially at the local level. We record more than 350 attacks against politicians. We saw that local level is the most vulnerable for this big issue in the country. Organized crime is capturing the electoral process, and they are not only killing or attacking candidates, they are also making these informal agreements with candidates. We have in Mexico a lot of examples of this, unfortunately, and even in the governorships, we have one state, San Luis Potosí, where the governor has a lot of legal prosecutions and legal process because his connections with organized crime, specifically the Zetas, right? So I think this is a biggest issue in Mexican politics. Violence continues. I'm recording all the attacks in political violence since the election, and I'm still recording the data, and this cycle continues. It wasn't stopped, right? So I think this is one of the biggest issues in electoral politics in Mexico. In 2024, we will have a lot of these, not just violence against politicians, but also these other types of strategies of organized crime to capture Mexican politics, and they are really successful at doing this. So, I mean, although the information is hard to get, right? Because it's not easy to get information about how, to what extent candidates are colluding or capturing by organized crime. But we know there's a lot of, especially at the local level, a lot of candidates who have these connections with organized crime. So I think this is a issue that we should putting attention, and especially the electoral authorities and also the security institutions should look at this, because this can really harm the electoral process in 2024. So I will leave my thoughts here, and thank you so much for the time and the space to be here.
Thanks, Amalia. It's pretty disturbing. We have a little less than half an hour. I'm going to try to summarize some of the questions we got in the Q&A, and I'm just going to throw out about half a dozen questions. A couple of them are targeted, but you panelists should feel free to take whichever ones you want to answer, and if possible, so we can get through a couple of rounds of questions, make your answer, try to confine it to 2 or 3 minutes at most. I know that's hard. So a couple of questions on the opposition, then a couple of questions on the ruling party, and then a couple of questions on electoral reform. First, on the opposition. One problem the opposition has is that it's not very popular. And Gustavo put it pretty nicely when he called the I hope I quote you correctly, Gustavo, the a zombie party, and the PAN a party that is rolling out the red carpet for the Spanish extreme right party Vox. And in light of that, there was a question about the Movimiento Ciudadano. And so the question is simply, how do you evaluate the potential for an alternative to the PRI and the PAN? And does the Movimiento Ciudadano have a future as a viable opposition party? I also wanted to follow up with Professor Becerra's point that the opposition really pursued a suboptimal electoral strategy in 2021, which I found really interesting. So if you could just say a word or two about what a better opposition strategy might have been and might be going forward. Now turning to Morena, there were a couple of questions about Morena. Morena is a hard party for those of us outside of Mexico, I think, to understand. It looks a lot like a personalistic party, but there's actually a lot of stuff going on within it. It's not as weak as, say, Fujimori's party in Peru or Correa's party in Ecuador. So what's the nature of the internal divisions or the internal tensions within Morena, and how sure are we that Morena has a future or life after AMLO? Couple of questions on electoral reform. Somebody in the audience asked, is electoral reform necessity? Is it necessary in Mexico? If it's not necessary, what the hell is AMLO doing? Why is he pursuing electoral reforms? Is it really possible to return election administration to gobernación? And one of our participants asked whether there remains any chance that AMLO will actually try to change the law and pursue re-election. One final question for me, and this is for Denise, and that is that as you yourself put it, you were pretty pessimistic about the direction of the regime over the last 3 years, for good reason. And you describe yourself as somewhat surprised by the resilience of democratic institutions during and after the midterm election, which is obviously good news. Not your surprise, but the resilience. What explains for you, or for any of you who want to touch on this, what explains the resilience of democratic institutions over the last year? Let me stop there. And why don't we just go, for simplicity's sake, in the order that you presented.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try to be brief. So first of all, the opposition is not very popular. Yeah, that's for sure. We do see differences at the local level, as I mentioned before, particularly in certain localities or municipalities where the opposition has been able to grow thanks to the middle classes and the group of opposition voters to López Obrador. But this was not mostly because they are convinced that they want to go back to the opposition, but because they are so upset with López Obrador and Morena, and they feel damaged by the fourth transformation agenda, that this is a strategic voting on the hand of the voters, on the side of the voters. What would be a better opposition strategy? So I would sum it up in timing, a candidate selection, the diagnosis of the electorate, and the agenda that they're going to pursue in campaigns. The opposition was not very successful in the timing of the announcement of the candidates. They actually had very difficult negotiations to select the candidates with the PAN, PRI, PRD. They even selected some candidates that were not very popular. And this would have, if they had done it differently, or if they had selected candidates that were more citizen-oriented candidates and not the traditional political, like feudal lords, they probably would have had a better electoral outcome. Also, the diagnosis of the opposition, they really don't know. They're sort of hitting everywhere. They try to attack López Obrador sometimes, then they try to attack Morena, and they are always discussing things in a very sophisticated way. They are not reaching the general public. So basically, they have a 30% segment of the vote of the electorate, because those are the ones that are opposing López Obrador. But it seems to be something of a roof that they are reaching. They're not able to reach the more sort of undecided voters, because they are not presenting an agenda that is credible or that can convince those voters. And this speaks to the Movimiento Ciudadano voters, because a lot of these voters that are upset with López Obrador and Morena, and they are upset with the opposition, are going to Movimiento Ciudadano. And at this point, Movimiento Ciudadano is basically doing a disservice to the anti-AMLO movement. Because first of all, it is hardly going to become a national level party, but it is taking votes away from the opposition. And just to give you some facts, the second option, or the second choice for Movimiento Ciudadano voters, is the PAN and the PRI, not Morena. So these are mostly opposition-leaning voters. So if you wanted to have like a grand opposition movement, Movimiento Ciudadano would have to sort of sacrifice its short and middle-term goals to become like the social democratic alternative and join the opposition in opposing López Obrador. But I think this is going to be very difficult to see. So we have to see whether the Movimiento Ciudadano voters are going to be strategic in the 2024 election, particularly in the presidential one. In terms of how sure we are that Morena has a future after López Obrador, well, of course it has a future, because we see how many states it's governing. And it's very likely that it's going to increase these states right now and in the next election, because we have 3 governorships from the PRI, 3 governorships from the PAN that are in dispute in 2022, and 2 governorships from the PRI. Morena is probably going to have important wins in those states. So Morena is still going to be around because it's governing so much at the state and local levels. But the risk for Morena is that it's going to become a very differentiated party across the country. We have seen this happen to the PRI and to the PAN, and they're going to have to cater to the local basis of voters, right? Before, the PAN used to be more associated to the middle classes and the business sector of the votes. But when it became a national party, it's also in some states like Campeche, it became more linked to the less advantaged segments of the population. And it had to change its agenda to become more socially oriented, right? So we can see that this may happen to Morena. And this is also going to be very consistent with the fact that the López Obrador dominant figure is not going to be around. So we're likely to see more local dominant figures for Morena, as we have seen right now in the PAN and the PRI. It's basically a lot of local negotiations that made this opposition alliance possible in the first place. And first, the electoral reform. Well, in my opinion, this is no moment to take risks. This is a moment to defend democratic institutions, not to deepen pernicious electoral reforms. Both the National Electoral Institute and the Electoral Tribune have made pacific transitions possible, including the López Obrador presidency. So tampering is, the way I talked about tampering is the use of public resources in electoral communication. It is also the use of social programs to maintain electoral structures. This is something that we have lived with all this time. What we cannot live with is an electoral institute or an electoral tribune that will be handed entirely to one party. This is something that hasn't happened in recent history and cannot happen in institutions like these. We have seen it happen in the Supreme Court. All the reforms that the president has proposed have had ideological leanings or have implied a benefit to his party. And this would be the same in case of his reform. And just listen to the voters. This is why the voters limited him in the past midterm election. They didn't give him more power. He has still given the trust of the population, but limited trust. So this is just the population not wanting him to concentrate more power and not wanting him to go against more institutions, right? So I think it would be a risk right now to have an electoral reform in the terms that López Obrador wants it. And it would be a danger to our democracy that so far, you know, it has a lot of flaws, but it has functioned.
Thanks. Denise. You're muted. Still muted.
Okay, great.
Okay.
The future of Movimiento Ciudadano. I think Movimiento Ciudadano has been important as an agenda setter, as a party that has put forth consistently a series of policy proposals and positions that are authentically of the left, that are more congruentes than López Obrador in terms of abortion rights, the defense of the defensa del medio ambiente, a series of positions that run in many ways more along the lines of a social democratic party. And that's why I think it's been able to become a recipient of candidacies for progressives that feel that their place is no longer in Morena. At the same time, and that's its positive side, the more negative aspect of Movimiento Ciudadano is that it's become a platform for opportunists, for political opportunists who need some sort of political organization with which to compete. And we saw that, for example, with the current election, the election of the current governor of Nuevo León. I think Movimiento Ciudadano is going to remain a regional force, not a national force, because in many voters' minds, the left is still Morena, although programmatically and in terms of policy proposals, I disagree with that interpretation. And another paradox of Morena is that it frequently criticizes the president for not being leftist or progressive enough. But when push comes to shove, Morena ends up voting with, Movimiento Ciudadano ends up voting with Morena in Congress. Is electoral reform necessary? I agree with Lorena. No, and not along the lines that the president is envisioning. I mean, there are many things that need reforming within the electoral system. I think that it's too expensive. I think I've been a champion of reducing party financing for many years. I don't think the current context is the appropriate context, because what it would do would create a playing field that was not level given Morena's access to government resources. And we would go back to a pre-1994, pre-1997 scenario where the opposition competes in a situation of enormous disadvantages. I think reforms would be needed along in the future to, for example, take away the registration of parties that violate party financing laws, because that's the major issue now. It's one of the major issues of all of the money, dinero bajo la mesa, that flows through the electoral system, and all parties violate the limits and then just pay the fine. So they don't have incentives to operate within the rules. That said, those are not some of the proposals that the president has put forth. His electoral reform entails moving the INE back to gobernación by saying we only needed it to be autonomous when there were bad people in power. We're the good guys. We can run decent and clean elections. The INE is too expensive. Its counselors were all sellouts and bad people, and we should just do away with it. And in the name of austerity and combating corruption, he would try to push that forward. I don't think it's going to be possible, because this is something that would require votes that he doesn't have. And I don't see the opposition actually voting for something that would be as self-destructive to them as moving the INE back to gobernación. I also, and this goes to your question of why the resilience of institutions. It's something that I'm trying to figure out, and I'm not sure that the resilience will continue. I hope it does, but it is not written in stone. And I think the resilience has to do, for example, in the case of the INE, if you look at the polls, the INE has more support than Andrés Manuel López Obrador, because it's been around for 20 years and people participate in elections. They are poll watchers, they son funcionarios de casilla. They believe that this is truly one of the good outcomes of the transition to democracy. So the INE has been trying to contain López Obrador for the past 3 years under immense pressure. But it is doing so more and more because it sees, I think it sees that citizens are reacting well to the constraints it is trying to put on the president. Other sources of resilience have to do with how much autonomy the institution has, constitutionally speaking, and in terms of how it's financed. Because one way of reducing autonomy and of going after institutions is not just discrediting them in the mañanera. It's not just calling out specific judges or ministers of the court or Coneval. It's reducing their financing. It's strangling institutions through manipulation of the public budget. And that's a way of altering checks and balances that the president finds uncomfortable. But if you look, for example, at the Competition Commission and why it presented an amparo, a stay against the reduction of government salaries by decree, or for example, the new rule whereby you cannot work in a sector that you regulated for 10 years to stop the revolving door that López Obrador, I think, legitimately was concerned by, but 10 years, as you probably know, it doesn't happen in any country. So the Competition Commission took the president to task through the judicial system. And the reason it was able to do so is because it has more constitutional autonomy than other institutions. Others, like regulatory commissions that depend on the executive, and where the president can staff them without having necessarily to pass through congressional votes. there we've seen less resilience. So I think that's actually a fascinating research project to examine the specific conditions of resilience in each one of these institutions and why that is the case. Now, the president has started to see that there is pushback. There is pushback in the polls, there is pushback in the electorate, there's pushback in the institutions. And the interesting thing about him is that he doesn't see this as a warning sign to alter his behavior. He's digging in his heels. So I think we're going to see more blatant attacks against autonomous institutions in the future. And politics in Mexico are just going to become more polarized and more contentious as a result of that.
Thanks, Denise. Gustavo.
Thank you. Maybe I'll just, I don't want to take too much time, but I'll just say a word about two of the questions that you offered and that the audience offered. The first one has to do with how to generate sort of alternatives within the opposition. And maybe the second one would be about the resilience of democratic institutions. So regarding the first one, the alternatives in the opposition, I think that there's so much inertia in the way that parties operate today in Mexico. I think there has to be a real reckoning as to what it takes, how to connect with people. There has to be a real citizen-oriented focus, some real grassroots work that I think has been abandoned. And in the last few years, what we've seen, and I mean, 10, 15, 20 years, it's a real elitist approach to electoral politics that clearly is not working. And I think it's one of the reasons why AMLO won the presidency. So a challenge for the opposition, in my view, is really to dare to embrace truly democratic practices within, to involve citizens in the decision-making process throughout. One of the lessons that we have is corruption is systemic in Mexico, right? No party is morally superior. The emphasis has to be on true democratic internal processes and citizen-oriented candidates. Another thing that I think is important is for the opposition to abandon sort of this, the sky is falling, everything is wrong. We were almost Sweden before, and now the country is really going down the drain. I mean, this turns people off. In my view is that there has to be a real recognition of just the many problems that we're dragging for decades. And that so many things that are really systemic, and I try to emphasize in the continuity emphasis in my own presentation today. Show results, right? Show results. Nothing is more compelling than showing results when you are in government at all levels. This isn't an opposition that is, outside of power throughout, right? At many different levels, it remains in power. It enjoys resources with which it can work to create a genuine citizen alternative in opposition. And it has been just a major sort of opportunity that has been forgone or wasted, right? So results, show proposals that are actually attuned to people's concerns. Right. I know it's easier said than done, of course, right? This inertia is hard to break from. There are many interests involved, but those are things that I would put on the table for opposition parties. The other thing I would say regarding the resilience of democratic institutions, I would agree that democratic institutions have been perhaps more resilient than one might have expected in recent years. I don't know, I think this is a really complex question, but I would point to the resilience of civil society as a major pillar, sort of propping up these institutions in this constant friction with the government trying to erode these institutions, right? So I would point to just the strength and resilience of Mexican civil society as playing an important role in the outcome that we're seeing today. I'll stop there. Thanks again.
Thank you, Gustavo. Amalia.
I would like to talk a little about Movimiento Ciudadano. I think Movimiento Ciudadano has a chance to become a truly policy-oriented party. And I think we will see in the following years if Movimiento Ciudadano really wants to be this party, like a really policy-oriented with a specific policies and proposals. And I agree with Denise when she said that it's a really local and regional party, and it's a real threat in some regions. We saw a lot of local candidates like Abel Murrieta in Cajeme and Alma Rosa Barragán in Guanajuato who were killed because they were the real options in local politics. So I think Movimiento Ciudadano, it's getting there. It's getting this real local political party, but also there are these opportunistic figures around the party. And we will see these kind of figures also in 2024, right? Like Samuel Garcia in Nuevo León. I mean, he was really successful in his campaign, and we can say that maybe his campaign was orchestrated by his wife, but I mean, he was really successful and he won the governorship in Nuevo León, and also the capital is for Movimiento Ciudadano. So I think it's a really interesting political party in Mexico. However, I mean, political parties in Mexico are in crisis, right? They don't have an ideology. They behave more opportunistic, and I think this is part of what we are seeing in Mexican politics. I'm really worried about the electoral reform that the president wants to push it in Congress. And I mean, maybe this is a personal experience in the scientific community. We're having a real hard time dealing with this government. And I think this government does not reform, they destroy. So I think, and I agree with Denise and Lorena, that maybe it's not the time to have this electoral reform, because they don't reform, they don't solve what is wrong, or they don't look at the specific things. They like to destroy, and I think that can be I mean, that can be a trouble in the Mexican democratic configuration.
It's an interesting point. They don't reform, they destroy. There was a question that I unfortunately didn't get to that would have asked you all to compare AMLO to Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, but that description I think pretty aptly characterizes the Bolsonaro government in Brazil. Folks, unfortunately, I need to close. I was hoping to get to another round, but we had such rich answers to the questions that we didn't get through round one, not the first time. I want to, first of all, thank Lorena Besera, Denise Gesser, Gustavo Flores, Macias, and Amalia Pulido Gomez for terrific presentations. We know you're all busy, and we appreciate your time. And then before departing, just want to announce that we're going to stick with Mexico, at least in part, in next week. We're going to have a panel on Mexican political scientist Mariano Sanchez Talanquer's forthcoming book, The Geography of State Power. If you don't know Mariano Sanchez Talanquer, he is a real emerging superstar in Mexican political science, and I strongly recommend that you come if you can. So many thanks to all of you who attended, and to our panelists again. Stay well, and if you're in Cambridge, stay dry.
Thank you.